أدائي الفنون. Allow me to introduce Maryam Monalisa Gharavi. She's an artist, poet, and theorist. And she's completed her PA from University of California, PhD from Harvard University, and is currently in the candidate at Broad College. And she's currently a Fulbright fellow based in Palestine and visiting fellow at Thank you for joining us.
والله إذا عربي بس أنا ما بفهمش إنجليزي. أنا صح جوالي في الأردن بحكي عربي بس مطالبة بس هي تحكي بالإنجليزي ليش ما عرفت تقول هلا ليش ترجمة؟ ترجمة؟ أنا بترجم. مش ترجمة واللياقة الترجمة الناس في أصحاب عايزين ترجمة غير كذا يعني سوى بس معظم عن بالإنجليزي. لا مش فارق هاي كنت أعطيت اليوم العيال هاي إيش تقول؟ تفضل هاي. كل الإعلانات ما في مشكلة بالسالفة. الترجمة بالترجمة حاضر ما في مشكلة. يعني خلينا نقول الأعراف الصحفية فيدون العالم ترى السيادة والذكاء. أول ما عرفت فعلا هاي الصفحة الإنجليزية رأسك زي الإنجليزي. هاي الإعلان تعرف بالعربي إيش يقول؟ شكرا لك راحت بس هي ما تتكلم عربي. الترجمة مشاكل.
أنا متأسفة كثير. أنا من إيران.
في حد ثاني يحتاج ترجمة؟
أنا أحكي بالإنجليزية اليوم. أنا آسفة كثير.
ما بتحكي عربي. ما بتحكي عربي بس ممكن تعملي محاضرة. ساعدنا بالترجمة. نعم. هو ساعدنا بالترجمة. ما مش محضرين هذا الشيء أو لازم نكون حضرنا. في أي حد ثاني يحتاج ترجمة؟ إذا حد يحتاج ترجمة بس ممكن نرجع لورا ونقعد يعني نحكي على سرعة الترجمة. ماشي. شكرا. بيس. عليا.
I've been traveling for about a month now, and they say that when you're a traveler, you don't really exist. So, at the end of a 2-week residency here at Ta'rud al-Fannun, I want to thank some of the people that made me feel like I really existed. Soha, Elina, Rana, Luma, Muhammad, Yanal, Ala, Rajab, Rida, Abu Amir, Amir, and Ahmed. I also want to thank you for indulging me because the thoughts I want to connect today are in pieces and parcels, still loose and a little raw, and I'm sharing them for the first time together, not as a presentation to say this is the conclusion I've come up with, but to actually formulate them or get as close to the idea as possible. And this very lab that's called experimental is, to me, in the sense of experimental, that you don't know where something is going to finish. And I hope to do just that in the very deep sense of the word. So I'm very grateful to have an audience as that takes shape. And if you make any connections that I overlook, I hope that we have a little time at the end to talk about them. Performative Ground. So when the talk was being translated for Ta'rud al-Fannun's literature, Ahmed, if I can say his name, told me that was a difficult description to translate, and it got me. I agree with him, and it got me really thinking about both parts of that title, performative and ground. And this is where I want to say that everything I want to say starts with the concrete and moves to the abstract and never in reverse. So when I say performative and when I say ground, I'm hoping to maybe talk about those etymologies and maybe uncover them. I moved to Ramallah 5 months ago. Initially, at least for the first 3 months, I felt a new, strange sensation that I'd never felt before, not even in Gaza, where I'd gone to make a film a few years prior. It was a very suffocating feeling, and you got the sense of being airless, of the air closing in on you. If you've ever been to Ramallah, you know that the air is quite clean and crisp, and its people notably hospitable and kind. So this sensation wasn't atmospheric or social, but somatic, so starting from the body. And at first I didn't talk to anyone about these small incidents in my day of gasping and panicking. But once I started sharing it, I knew that I wasn't the only one who was struggling for air. Contain is a film video that reenacts, and I'm going to excuse me. It's a 4-minute single-shot film experiment that I'm reenacting from 1979. So this is a film featuring the Brazilian artist Gharavi. The work includes a handmade parangolé, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. It's a term for a costume or a mobile sculpture that inspires an unexpected or situational body movement. This work that I made is based in Ramallah and includes 2 collaborators, choreographer Samar Haddad Keen and performer Ramzi Naqsheh. The work is finished but hasn't been edited in 2 different channels. So it's 2 channels, the original from 1979 and my reenactment. But that hasn't been edited into a composite yet. This is the first time I'm even showing it. So I'm going to show you the 4-minute clip of Gharavi in 1979, and then I'll play about 1 minute of my performer. So let's hope the audio works here. I'm going to play you, maybe we can use the audio from Parangolay. You're going to have to just take my word for it that they line up perfectly. So in Contain, we spatially mapped each gesture and step in the remake and enlisted our performer to conjure a new emotive landscape. What was once spontaneous and improvisational becomes choreographed and mapped. The freedom and authenticity of subjects cannot be taken for granted, and the friction created in the relationship between live performance and recorded film creates an awareness of that. As the reenactment creates a simultaneous one-to-one relationship to the reenacted, so shots, costumes, gestures, etc., it also creates a proposition beyond the surface of the film. For example, what's at stake in the remake of a work made under a 1970s Brazilian dictatorship and present-day occupied Palestine? Further, what are the dyads activated in such a structure? So a dyad is an element of, two parts, for example, mother and child. So outside, inside, entrance, exit, union, separation, opacity, transparency, body, costume, head, feet, and of course, air and ground. So why performance and why reenactment? Because such a performative gesture, when it is enacted faithfully, changes the alchemy of what it enacts, transforming both the original and the copy in the process. It lets us de-link the natural from nature, or denaturalize the natural. The second part of the title, should let me get this back. I'm sorry, I can't seem to move this mouse. The second part of the title is Ground, and this leads into a second work I've been producing in Palestine. Unlike Contain, which came out of a psychosomatic experience, Performative Ground began by complete surprise. Because more than anywhere else I've ever been in Palestine, the ground, and I'm talking about literally the ground, is in a constant state of agitation and change. So this led to an ongoing series of which I'm going to show you a little of. Some background. I've been thinking about walls, enclosures, and border geographies for a long time. I've explored, particularly in a scholarly vein, the complexities of sovereignty in such structures, or rather the simplicity. So for example, I'm a state. I build a wall precisely because it's in your face and aggressive. I want you to see that aggression. I want you to see it, the demarcation of my political will. And in particular, I want to bend the intricate consequences of separation to my will. And I assert the power to do so in creating these enclosures, these walls, and border geographies. And I give them a name whether or not they presuppose my intention. And in fact, I'd come to Palestine with such a project, not necessarily an artistic one, which is why I was there in the first place, but particularly in comparison to Brazil, where I'd spent 3 years and where the Brazilian government has built walls around the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, a project that is also ongoing. But in Palestine, I had seen the wall, I knew the wall, and I knew the modes of knowledge that were going to get at my question. The betrayal that happened once I was on the ground was the ground. Remembering the absolute devastation that was wreaked on Gaza in the summer of 2014, after previous bombing campaigns and decades of blockade, and the razing of homes and the utter destruction of life. In the summer of 2014, we witnessed the bombing of cemeteries, rows and rows of depressions made in the ground to bury entire families, and people made twice, 3 times, 4 times refugees in their own land. So this was the unspeakable event that preceded my arrival and left me feeling like there was really nothing else left to say. Meanwhile, and I continued to believe this, I didn't think that the full extent of the violence exacted on Palestinian life and future could be adequately captured in documentary photo or film or video. For example, if you're a Palestinian living in Palestine, you're subject to administrative violence that cannot be visualized. You pay what I call an apartheid tax. It's actually 16% in your water bill, your heating bill, your electricity bill, and the gasoline in your car. Each month you're paying these taxes back to the Israeli government on top of other, bureaucratic forms of violence, of which I'm sure you all know. So I immersed myself in readings of care as a kind of grounding of how literally where one's foot falls. And what do I mean by care? In Latin, care is securitas, so sine cura. You are without care. You are secure when you are without care because something or someone outside of you, the state, the police, etc., is securing you. There's a long tradition of this idea embedded in Greek and Roman law, all the way to the 21st century, right? When we think of our own laws that are mostly, especially in Israel, mostly based on Roman law, but also when we think of things like airport security, security systems for our homes, etc., etc. So the ground, what is beneath you, is a site of care because it's what you take for granted. It catches you in your instability. When you take a step forward, you're actually off balance in that step forward. But you know that when you lower your foot, you're going to hit ground. And that's when I turn my attention to this organism that we take for granted and consider its non-stability, its transience, its vulnerability. Specifically, I noticed how the ground seemed to operate against my expectations. I take a step forward, I land on earth, concrete, sidewalk, so I know the ground is there, I know it's going to catch me. But I don't account for the fact that it has its own logic. That in fact it's teeming with the whole world I don't see while I'm in the world on the ground. Again, it is not a given. Ground has always been a given, and we should turn our attention to the ways it isn't necessarily that. It contracts, it mutates, it changes. That something so given is so mutable should astonish us, or at least I choose to be astonished by this, because in that mutability, in that changing transformation, it overcomes its naturalizing effect. The idea that it is by nature firm and unchanging, for example. It denatures its own nature, and in doing so becomes performative. This hasn't always been the case, particularly in Western history and theology. The view of the world until the 18th century was divided in two ways. Either the world was a perpetual object of care, exhibited by a perfect deity, so the world is a garden, for example, or it was produced by a divine creator and left to operate automatically, so like the world as a clock. But these views were becoming increasingly difficult to accept. One of the most, if not the most cataclysmic event in Europe that reversed the tendency to see the world as a garden or a clock was the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. Obviously there wasn't photography to capture this event, but the closest witness accounts that we have of this are these engravings by Laqaء. So from left to right, that's St. Paul's Church, the Lisbon Cathedral, and the Opera House. Many depictions of the event followed, showing Lisbon in flames, followed by a tsunami, maremoto, overwhelming ships in the harbor. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 occurred on November 1st at 9:20 in the morning. And by the way, this was All Saints' Day, so it was a big Eid for all of Europe, Catholic Europe. It lasted for 10 minutes. Modern estimates of the earthquake see it reaching 9 on the Richter scale. The impact was felt as far away as Finland and Morocco, and I believe Beirut. Of Lisbon's 275,000 population, 90,000 were killed. 10,000 were killed in North Africa for the total estimate of about 100,000 killed. Fires, so people had abandoned their fire in their homes, so the candlelight lit the houses on fires, and these raged for weeks, and the city burned to a complete crisp. Some sought shelter by the sea, on moored ships, and that would prove a deadly solution as a tsunami with the waves reaching 6 meters in the air shot up and engulfed Lisbon. Collapse, burning, and drowning were near total. Lost in the aftermath were nearly all of the historical archives of Portuguese maritime exploration, including art like the works of Titian, and of course every national palace and church, every church and national palace in Lisbon, and in effect, Portuguese rule over its colonies. Lisbon sits at the center of a tectonic plague, even though earthquake activity occurs at plate borders. So, the idea was like, how could this happen? While theories of how such a massive earthquake could upend the city have been put forward, none has been conclusive. The earthquake turned Voltaire into an atheist, Kant into a seismologist, and reduced the King of Portugal into a timid and claustrophobic man for the rest of his life. But 260 years after the event, we still don't know why or how it happened. The German writer Werner Hamacher has claimed that the earthquake's consequence extended into the vocabulary of philosophy, making the common metaphor of firm grounding for philosophers' arguments shaky and uncertain. So I'm quoting from Hamacher, under the impression exerted by the Lisbon earthquake, which touched the European mind in one of its more sensitive epochs, the metaphorics of ground and tremor completely lost their apparent innocence. They were no longer mere figures of speech. End quote. Hamaker also claimed that the foundational certainty of Descartes' philosophy began to shake following the Lisbon earthquake. The earthquake suggested to most Europeans, from the ordinary person to the philosopher in the halls of the academies, that God was not as careful as conventionally reported. That God was not only inscrutable or unknowable or unreadable was one thing, but now he was also careless. So this jeopardized any sense of existential security. How could you ever remove your care if there was no greater agent to remove it for you? Further, whether theologian or scientist, the event that shook the Portuguese capital represented a state of exception that would either uphold or definitively destroy notions of sovereignty, so trust in geological or cartographic measurements was effectively gone. What is the notion of a border, after all, after this? And if you followed the Haiti earthquake, you'd remember the American preachers who claimed that it was punishment from God for disobeying the natural order of colonial French rule, that the earthquake was unleashed in Haiti. And this was very similar to the 18th century, where preachers of every confession evoked sinfulness and divine vengeance on Europe. And physicists, on the other hand, claimed meteorological and planetary shifts as the primary cause. Kant, who I mentioned before, devoted at least 3 essays to the earthquake and discouraged anyone who would argue against nature's indifference to human suffering. So this is a really natural break from the idea of a natural order or divine decree, like this happened because God willed it, but rather, this is a natural occurrence. This was very new. John Hamilton, in his book Security, which I really recommend, says, quote, "The age of the Earth's desecurement that began with Galileo's notorious declaration, e pur si muove, and yet it moves, no longer simply applied to our planet's relegated position in the cosmos, but now referred to the very ground beneath our feet." End quote. I also mentioned Voltaire before. The earthquake's aftermath would so disgust and outrage him that he begrudged the implications of philosophical optimism almost immediately. So these are people like Leibniz and Alexander Pope and others. I want to read a part of his poem called Poem on the Lisbon Disaster, written in the year 1756, if you'll indulge me. "O unhappy mortals, O deplorable earth, O dreadful gathering of all mortals, eternal maintenance of useless pain, mistaken philosophers who cry, all is well. Come, contemplate these frightful ruins, this wreckage, these shreds, these unfortunate cinders, these women, these children heaped one upon the other, these scattered limbs beneath the broken marble." So, O mortals, O earth, O mortals gathering, it's not just the victims of the earthquake that are mortal. Almost by contamination, the earth is also too. It's fragile, it's unpredictable, it's transitory. He says, this wreckage, these shreds. So nothing can be taken for granted anymore, not even the ground that we walk on. I'm interested in this earthquake because it's an encounter, obviously extreme, but an encounter between nature and technology, or the non-man-made and the man-made. We're no longer so naive, of course, as the unexpected nature of such events, even as to the unexpected nature of these events, especially after blowback from human poisoning of the ecosystem, a kind of unnatural nature. So we know these things happen now, right? With the rise of the nation state in the 20th and 21st centuries, as the man-made inalterably destroys the man-made, the encounter has changed too, and how we view security has changed inalterably with it. It's exactly the possibility and probability of a performative ground outside of human control that we can determine what is within human control. In other words, I don't wish to pose Gaza 2014 as a Lisbon of 1755, quite the opposite. There are many intractable issues in the world. One could even say right now we're in Al-Ghod, the Jordan Rift Valley, we're literally sitting on it, and we wouldn't be immune to something, a tectonic activity. But human-made disasters, such as the kind unleashed, is not one of them. It is not one of those intractable events. I want to end on a sort of end on a work on ground that I completed during this residency at الفن called Friends and Enemies. Beginning in the 1970s, the Japanese artist Onkawara would send mail, typically these Western Union telegrams, to his friends with a single message. And you can see that. And these are the postcards that I created here. So the materials used are spray paint, rubber stamps, and postage. I'm going to send the one for my enemies out if you want to see them. The ones for the friends are here. So this is what the recipients of the postcards, so these are just the friends received this email, obviously not the enemies. Dear friend, you're part of an artwork I'm creating during a residency at الفن in Jordan. The edition of handmade postcards comprising friends and enemies after Onkawara align with the 14 days of the residency and consist of 7 pieces of mail sent to friends and 7 to enemies. One day, perhaps, the messages sent to friends may be reunited or accumulated, though never one imagines what is sent to enemies. So the friends were 7 artists, and the enemies were President Barack Obama, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the President of the French Republic, François Hollande, Prime Minister David Cameron, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, Raymond Odierno, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons in the United States. This friend-enemy distinction in political theory is, of course, a very famous one. Certainly not one I invented. I'm not interested in the political theory, but I want to talk about it. Carl Schmitt's The Concept of the Political, or Der Begriff des Politischen, was published in 1927 with just such a theorem. The distinction in Schmitt's overarching understanding of the political realm is precisely the distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced. In other words, all political actions can really, and the state itself can always be reduced to one thing, and that's the friend-enemy distinction. Despite potential economic trade or other everyday dealings with an entity such as the enemy remains still the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient for his nature that he is, and I'm quoting here from Schmitt, in a specially intense way, existentially something different and alien, so that in the extreme case, conflicts with him are possible. So the key word for him is possible. What always matters is only the possibility of conflict. So the actual number of conflicts between 2 groups or nation states throughout history is irrelevant. Simply the potentiality of violent action is sufficient for the friend-enemy scenario to become a reality between 2 or more groups. I actually say performative element to this, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. Schmitt makes the link between the conception of enemy and potential conflict unmistakably explicit. And I'm reading here from The Concept of the Political. For to the enemy concept belongs the ever-present possibility of combat. End quote. In stressing the literalness of these explanations, Schmitt proffers that such terms as friend and enemy have their true meaning specifically because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing. So conflict here is not just a metaphorical conflict, but with the understanding of an actual clash with bloodshed in the fullest meaning of the term. How does this fit within Schmitt's understanding of the state? Why talk about this after, the Lisbon earthquake, for example? Schmitt's description of the state, the closest he ever comes to an actual definition, is his famous statement that the concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political. So this friend-enemy distinction is not just, is actually prior to any other understanding of politics. Although he admits the link between state and political as being an unsatisfactory circle, the friend-enemy distinction sheds at least some light on these terms. So the state for him is not just a polis, right, in the Greek sense, but a condition approaching a territorial monopoly on legitimate violence. It's who is allowed legitimate violence. That's the kind of state we're talking about, and that's actually, even though he's a sort of, a very authoritarian figure, that is de facto our notion of state. Schmidt was an extremist about this position, and I find his extremism extremely useful because it didn't lean on the abstract. First and foremost, it leans on the concrete. He writes that what constitutes an existential danger to one's own form of life can be judged only by the participants of a potential conflict, because it is they who have experienced the challenge of the enemy. So this is like this is a very embodied experience. This is you going through airport security. The specifically political perspective which informs this judgment emerges out of a first-hand encounter with the enemy. The friend-enemy distinction is so key to this philosophy that he writes, state, republic, society, class, as well as sovereignty, constitutional state, absolutism, dictatorship, economic planning, neutral or total state, and so on, are incomprehensible if one does not know exactly who is being affected, combated, or negated by such a term. And the reverse is also true. His term for society is people. If a people or a state don't have the capacity or the will to make this friend-enemy distinction, they no longer exist politically. So in short, the friend-enemy distinction was a crucial part of this mission to develop a viable and consistent political theory of the state, one that strove to address the historical and political events of the day. Remember that in Germany around the time he's writing this is a country left humiliated after World War I and occupied by French and Belgian troops in the Rhinemar in 1923. And of course the political unrest of the Weimar period really distressed him and perhaps even played a role in his rise to give allegiance to the Nazis and after Hitler's rise to power. So he really saw this theory as a decisive one. And I want to end here maybe by this sort of, I don't want to jump around too much, but I want to end here and say that thank God that art isn't so decisive, right? And thank God that we don't have to be so decisive, even though this distinction of a friend-enemy distinction actually belies the kind of system or state that we all live in, wherever you live in, whether or not there is a state. Thank God that it isn't so decisive and that it doesn't in fact have to be a permanent ground. Much like if you'll excuse the term, the tectonic shift that happens in Europe from, the most ordinary person to, Voltaire and Descartes and Kant. So I guess I want to end on that note that thank God that we don't have to be so decisive. That's it. Thank you. Should we get some lights? I also wanted to say that these set of ideas all happened here at the Fun, even though I just went to Lisbon a week before coming here. And one could say that the architecture, but actually the ground here at the Fun had everything to do with some of these ideas and formulations, in the sense that if you go outside or if you, walk through Muhammad or Yanaad, you see, what is supposed to be the Byzantine ruin on top of a Roman ruin on top of perhaps, the 1837 earthquake of Jordan, which likely destroyed many of these artifacts. And even such things as, Heracles becoming St. George, becoming the sacred element of al-Khadr in Islam, and so on and so on. So it's the artifacts of these periods that are being dug up from the ground, not necessarily the architecture, but the ground, the earth itself, that reenacts and retells, and is constantly performing history in this really living way. So I've been profoundly moved by that. Maybe not for some of you who've lived in, 4,000-year-old territories for as long as you have, but I've been profoundly moved and changed by that experience.
Questions?
Yeah, I don't know, any ideas, questions, comments?
I have two questions. The first one is not concerning your work. Thank you, first of all, for your presentation. The first question is not about the artistic work, but it's just how would you enter into Palestine, I mean, the border, the first question. The second one is about contain to contain and also friends and enemies. I saw that I see you show like always an opposition, but in duality. Like there is friends and enemy, or in contain to contain there is you mentioned the different opposition like head and I don't remember all of them, but you mentioned like many couples of and I don't know, I would like you to explain more this, because I don't see usually the duality, like opposition just in, I see more the multiplicity or heterogeneity of, in the opposition itself. I mean, I know that there are even describing like identities. I don't want to enter into the issues of identity, but let's stay in these two words. I don't know if you...
That sounds great. So the first question that she asked was, I think how I got into Palestine?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second was about the dualities or dyads in the two works. So the first one's a little easier. I first came to Palestine in 2008, and I went to Gaza, as I mentioned briefly, to make a film, and that required a military permit. And to this day, you can't. I'm not allowed to go to Gaza now. I can't go. But so that was the first time I came to Palestine. It was under those auspices. This year, I'm living in Ramallah as a Fulbright fellow. So I have a visa through the Ministry of Interior. Having said that, as I don't know, I've talked to some of you about that didn't. So last week, 2 weeks ago, before coming to Jordan, I was in Lisbon. And so I had to re-enter, so you're sort of, like walking confidently with your passport, Ministry of Interior, but I was detained for 10 hours. I don't like talking about that stuff because sometimes I feel like it's disrespectful to Palestinians that, it's like, that those inaccessibilities or immobilities and headaches and hassles that are created for me, I feel like at the end of the day are, maybe sometimes not even worth talking about, but so I am allowed to live there. I have a visa to live there for a year, but that hasn't, hopefully they won't create an issue on my way back, but that certainly hasn't, stopped them from doing so. And that's why I bring up the friend-enemy distinction. I mean, it's not just to talk about political theory with you all, but to actually say that, these concepts are they're not just concepts, they're very much the concrete reality of where we're living. I'm Iranian. So, I was born in Iran, and, I'm sure after, among many enemies, my country of birth is the #1 enemy. So that distinction is felt as the minute I touched down to Ben Gurion. Your second question is really interesting, and one I want to maybe think out loud about. I hope it's coherent. I'm interested in dyads, not necessarily duality. So a duality, for example, is like the Cartesian idea, right? So like when you're in school and you're sitting behind, a school desk, like the idea that you're just a person with a head from the head up, and you don't really exist from the body. Like in order for me to have a conversation with you, I just have to forget that I exist as a body, and you're just looking at me, and I'm speaking to you as a head. Right, like it happens, but it's a Cartesian duality, and I'm not interested in that duality at all, actually. And I think it's been, fairly well combated in not just philosophy, but in everything, in art. I mean, look outside, go to Emily Josser's work, right? That embodied sense of a wholeness and multiplicity, as you mentioned, is very present. But I am interested in the dyad, at least in the friend-enemy distinction. So the dyad is like the idea of almost like an eternal dyad, like mother-child, in, out. So to go back to contain, like when I came to Ramallah, I'd actually talked to I'll bring her name up once again because she's a faculty member of mine. And I talked to Emily about what kind of work I wanted to create that year in Palestine. So I'm here for a year, I promised to do this work, I'm teaching at a university, what kind of work do I want to produce? And she, you know, she was very right, I think, in saying, you know, don't refuse to plan something, refuse to know what you want to find, because once you go there, you're going to find it. And I think she's right about that. And it's in that encounter, in that concrete encounter with Ramallah, and that airlessness and sense of panic that I was talking about, a very somatic one, like literally like rising from my chest, that this came about. And so that inside, outside, interior, exterior, like this feeling that like I can't get out of here, I have access, you know, I guess I can leave, I can come to Jordan, for example, but it's still this very airless feeling. And that was very real. That, and I was trying to like find something that I could do that spoke to that concrete realness, if that makes any sense. And so that's where the reenactment comes about. And I've done that a few times in other works, but never so literally, like every step and every gesture. And I think, as I was saying, I mean, I want to claim this. I hope the work makes this, once it's finished, I hope you can see it, and I hope it does this on its own. But my claim is that the reenactment, or what is enacted, actually changes the texture, the alchemy of the original. So it's not that I want to create another dyad between original and copy, you know, Edward Jessica 1979 and my performer. In fact, my performer is here. He's sitting right behind you, Ramzi Natshe, by absolutely no, you might recognize him from the film, through absolutely no doing of mine. He happens to be an Amman. But I don't know if that gets at your question, but I hope that if one starts with a dyad that is so clear, right? Inside, outside, mother, child, those things are so clear. I don't like clarity. I hope that starting from there, one can, you know, complete the work in another way, like as a viewer, as a spectator, as a person, as you can complete the work in another way that gets outside of that dyad, that manages to escape it in a way that isn't so clear and is maybe a little bit more opaque. I don't know if that makes any sense. But I'm only interested up to that point as a starting point. I'm not interested in it as any kind of like eternal conclusion or anything like that. But thank you for your question. It was thoughtful. I don't want to keep people here if there's no more questions, but last chance.
It's more like an explanation. I still don't get the connection between the Lisbon earthquake and then moving to the friends and the enemies. So if you could like elaborate a little bit more on that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't think I made it as I said, it's sort of like loose pieces that I'm hoping at some point to be able to glue. The idea that before 1755, and I'm speaking in these huge generalities, not to sort of like indulge myself, but because there's a real historical record to this, the idea that, you know, if you think about like world systems, that the world is either created by an immaculate deity, and it's, you know, this garden of delights, or the world is created in a more like, you know, I mentioned the world of the clock, right? Like the garden and the clock. Like these ideas were really like in circulation, and this event was so cataclysmic as to actually undo many of these deeply, firmly held world beliefs and systems. I mean, world, I'm talking about Western Europe, obviously. It was completely cataclysmic. And I guess the connection for me is that there wasn't really such a, there were countries, but there wasn't the modern notion of the nation state as there is in the 20th century, as you know, the very country that we're sitting on is a product of that. And the idea that a world belief about territory, about border, about colony, the Portuguese colonies in many parts of Africa, as well as Indochina, as well as Brazil, the idea that this sort of like falls apart at the seams, literally, right? Like if you go to, I mean, Mozambique, they're still speaking Portuguese, but many of the Portuguese colonies no longer even speak it, right? It literally fell apart. That this so-called natural event, right, was so cataclysmic to that is really interesting for me. Whereas I think looking at the notion of the nation state is also like a very firmly, you know, we have imaginations and we have discourses, there's futurism and others that attempt to look beyond the nation state, look beyond this like extremely deeply held principle. I don't think we obviously like haven't we haven't gone to 1756. It's still 1755, if that makes any sense. And but that doesn't mean that that notion is not indestructible either, right? And I think I bring up Schmidt not to sort of like glue him in a kind of theoretical way to my work, although of course like I care about it. I bring that up is just in you know, this authoritarian reactionary, you know, philosopher, and to say that in many ways he was sort of right, like that dyad, that sort of the friend-enemy distinction goes to the very heart of who we think we are, right? Both in terms of like the stranger outside the door, the security system, you know, airport security, making sure like, you know, there's accountability for who's in and who's out. All of these security systems that are constantly around us that we're like, you know, sometimes up against, I guess, but usually we're in it like fish in water. All of those have a very they're a very elemental part of us, which is why I think the Schmittian concept is almost more difficult, right? There was a time where there was the idea that, you know, like atheism, for example, I'm not here advocating atheism, but like that idea, the idea that God is not just a benevolent deity, or that, you know, that your actions cause nature to you know, to react or something. That was a really like truly deeply held, firmly held world system, not unlike the nation state. But I obviously don't, you know, far be it from me to say like what comes after that, and that I think that dyad, the friend enemy, is far more intractable in a way. And that's why I want to sort of say, like, I'm not trying to like really look for the conclusions, and I'm certainly not a philosopher, and I don't think philosophers should have all the fun, you know. I think we should think through these realities, but really for me, it's like, I want to start from a very, literally the concrete and earth, like something that literally shook the earth. It took something to shake the earth for those world systems to be kind of rethought, for geographies, you know, to change, for colonial world to fall apart. It really did take that. I don't want to transpose it on the 20th century. Like I said, I don't want to do like a comparison. I'm a comparatist by training, but I don't want to do like a natural comparison between that and the disasters of the 21st century, one that, you know, one that the world just witnessed. And I think to some degree, I find myself asking, like, does anyone even, you know, address that just happened, that Gaza just happened, you know? It's a much more intractable dyad. It's a much more, it's intrinsic. And I don't know what the you know, the cataclysmic event has to be, you know. I'm not like, you know, waiting, I'm not waiting for a kind of prophetic apocalypse moment, but I think it's in, you know, I think that's why I was saying like Schmidt is not conclusive or decisive. I think we have to find less clear, more opaque ways of seeing that, if that makes any sense. At least that's where I stop. Thank you all for coming very much and indulging me. Thank you.